There's a question scientists spent decades trying to answer, and when they finally did, the results surprised almost everyone who had assumed they already knew. If you lined up every population on Earth and ranked them by the age of their DNA, not the age of their culture, not the age of their civilization, not the date they wrote their first law or built their first city, but the raw genetic age of their lineage, the point at which their ancestors diverged from the rest of humanity, which group would CE-ohm out oldest? The answer, as it turned out, was not the one most people would guess. It was not the oldest empire, not the most ancient written language, not the civilization that built the pyramids, and the discovery that finally answered the question did not come from an excavation or a fossil. It came from a cotton swab, a tube in a laboratory that had no idea what it was about to find. This is the story of what DNA finally revealed about the deep age of the human family, and why the result dismantled assumptions that had sat unchallenged for generations. To understand what scientists were actually measuring, you need to understand one deceptively simple idea. Every time a cell divides and copies its DNA, it makes tiny errors. These errors are called mutatio NS, and they accumulate over time at a roughly predictable rate, like sediment building up on a riverbed. Because of this, geneticists can read a strand of DNA the way a geologist reads rock strata, counting the layers to estimate how long ago a process began. This technique, known as the molecular clock, allows researchers to look at the genetic differences between two populationes and calculate, within a range, how long ago they shared a common ancestor. The wider the genetic gap, the deeper the split. And when scientists began applying this method systematically across global populations, one pattern emerged so clearly that it forced a complete reframing of how human history is told. Africa did not merely birth the human species. It continued to host its oldest surviving branches long after the rest of humanity had scattered across the world. The deepest population split in all of modern human history is the one between the Koisan people of southern Africa and every other group on Earth. Ancient genomic SAQ. Witnesses suggest this divergence may have begun as early as 260,000 to 350,000 years ago. That number is staggering when you hold it still and think about it. Anatomically modern humans, the version of Homo sapiens that we recognize as our own kind, emerged roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, which means the Koisan lineage was already branching away from the ancestral human population. At nearly the same moment, the species itself was taking shape. They were not simply old. They were old in a way that challenged the entire framework scientists had been using to map human origins. Published research in Nature confirmed that the Koisan, also known as the San or Bushmen, represent the oldest known lineage of modern humans, and that within their genomes, researchers on 1.3 million novel DNA differences compared to other populations, differences so numerous and so distinctive that they pointed toward a depth of separation unlike anything recorded elsewhere in the human family. To put that genetic distance in concrete terms, groups from southwestern desert Australia are more genetically different from groups of northeastern Australia than native. Americans are from Siberians, and that is within a single continent. The Koisan separation from all other modern humans is older still, but here is what makes the Koisan story even more extraordinary. Research from Nanyang Technological University and PN State University found that Koisan individuals exist whose ancestors did not interbreed with any other ethnic group for the last 150,000 years, and that the Koisan were the majority group of living humans on Earth for most of that period, until approximately 20,000 years ago. For a vast, almost incomprehensible stretch of time, they were not a minority population clinging to the margins. They were the dominant human presence on the planet. The civilizations that fill the history books, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, China, represent barely the final 2% of that timeline. Research published in the American Journal of Hume and Genetics examined 500 mitochondrial DNA sequences and identified two Koisan haplogroups known as L0D and L0K that represent so many of the deepest rooting maternal lineages in all of modern humanity. The split between these two lineages alone dates to approximately 145,000 years ago, and the broader split between the Koisan lineage and other modern humans has been dated to no later than 90,000 years ago. To place that in perspective, anatomically modern humans only left Africa in large numbers around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. The Koisan genetic line was already distinct long before that migration even began, and yet, for most of record and head history, the Koisan were not studied as the oldest branch of the human family. They were dismissed, displaced, and in some historical periods actively hunted. The people carrying the deepest roots of human ancestry were, for centuries, treated as if they occupied its outermost fringe. What happened next in the research, the second result that scientists did not expect, would complicate the picture even further. The Koisan result was extraordinary on its own. But when scientists widened their lens and asked Ked a second question, which populations outside Africa carry the oldest unbroken genetic lineages, the answer pointed to a PLAce almost no one expected. Not to the cradle of ancient Egypt, not to the river civilizations of the Fertile Crescent, not to the mountain kingdoms of Asia. The answer, confirmed across multiple independent studies published in the journal Nature, pointed to an island continent at the bottom of the world that most of the academic world had barely looked at closely. The most comprehensive genetic study of Indigenous Australians conducted to date determined that Aboriginal Australians represent the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, dating back more than 50,000 years, and that modern Aboriginal Australians are the direct descendants of the first people who ever settled the continent. That finding did not emerge from a single paper or a single team. It was corroborated across multiple research groups working independently, using different methodologies, and arriving at the same conclusion. The consistency of that convergence is what gave the result its weight. The story written in their DNA begins with the great departure from Africa. According to researchers at the University of Cambridge and the University of Copenhagen, the ancestors of Indigenous Australians were the first group to split off from the primary out-of-Africa migration. While the ancestors of European and Asian peoples became genetically distinct in the record around 42,000 years ago, the precursors of today's Aboriginal Australians and Papuans had already diverged, approximately 58,000 years ago. That earlier branch point is precisely what makes them genetically oldest among living populations outside Africa. Every other G-group on the non-African side of the family tree separated later. The ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians were already traveling their own path thousands of years before those other branches even existed. What happened next is where the story becomes even more remarkable. Around 50,000 years ago, the migration reached Sahul, the prehistoric supercontinent made up of what is now Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea before rising sea levels split them apart. At that point, Aboriginal Australians became genetically isolated from the rest of the world, and they remained so, not for a century or a millennium, but for the overwhelming majority of their existence as a people. That genetic isolation lasted until approximately 4,000 years ago. For the preceding 46,000 years, their populations developed, diversified, and adapted in ways no other human group on Earth could replicate. B, because no other human group had been separated from the global gene pool for anything like that duration. The scale of the diversity that resulted should stop every reader cold. Researchers found that groups from southwestern desert Australia are genetic ally more different from groups of northeastern Australia than Native Americans are from Siberians. And this is within a single continent. To appreciate what that means, Native Americans and Siberians are separated by an ocean, by thousands of kilometers, and by the entirety of the Pacific. Yet two Aboriginal Australian communities sitting within the same continent have accumulated more genetic distance from each other than those two groups have from one another across the entire globe. That is what 50,000 years of continuous separation produces inside a landmass. But the deep age of Aboriginal Australian DNA carries one more layer of complexity that scientists did not fully appreciate until they looked more carefully. Aboriginal Australians and our closest genetic relatives, the Papuans of New Guinea, carry the highest traces of archaic introgression from Denisovans, an extinct lineage of ancient humans, of any population on Earth, at approximately 4 to 6% of their genome. The Denisovans were a distinct human species, known from bones recovered in a Siberian cave, whose full geographic range remains one of the great unsolved questions in paleoanthropology. Research published in Cell found that modern Papuans carry hundreds of gene variants inherited from not one, but two deeply divergent Denisovan lineages that had themselves been separated from each other, FOR, over 350,000 years. The people, ranked among the oldest human populations on Earth, do not simply carry ancient modern human DNA. They carry traces of encounters with other human species entirely, encounters so old that the species they met has since vanished from the face of the planet. There is a statement that Aboriginal elder Aubrey Lynch made when the Cambridge results were published that sits entirely outside the language of genetics. This study confirms our beliefs that we have ancient connections to our lands and have been here far longer than anyone else, he told researchers. Our ancestors were the first real human explorers. For generations, scientists had conducted research on these communities while systematically dismissing their own accounts of their origins as myth. The DNA said otherwise. The stories were older than the doubt. And yet, even with all of this establishment hid, the Koisan depth in Africa, the Aboriginal Australian isolation outside it. The most jarring single discovery in this entire field came not from a remote tribe, not from an ancient burial site, not from a government-funded genome project. It came from a routine consumer DNA test mailed in by an ordinary family in South Carolina. What that test revealed forced scientists to tear up one of their most fundamental assumptions about the age of the entire human male lineage. In 2012, a man submitted Hi, sDNA to a genealogy testing company. He was a descendant of Albert Perry, an African-American who had lived in South Carolina in the 19th century. A man born into slavery, whose name appears in old records, and whose story seemed to be exactly the kind of ordinary, painful American history that leaves little trace. The test came back, and when the company's technicians low-oaked at the result, they found something that did not fit any category they had ever seen: the Y-chromosome in that sample. The piece of genetic material passed from father to son, unchanged by the mixing of other genes, did not match any known human lineage on record. It sat entirely outside the existing family tree of all men on Earth. The discovery, published in 2013, led that Perry carried what geneticists later called Haplogroup A00, the oldest known male lineage ever identified, dating back more than 300,000 years. His bloodline had diverged from all other modern humans, long before the appearance of Homo sapiens as we know them. That last detail is what makes the discovery so jarring. The human species, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, emerged approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Albert Perry's Y-chromosome lineage branched away from the rest of the human paternal family tree before that point. The man working in the fields of South Carolina carried in his cells a genetic signature E older than the species itself, or at least older than any previously known version of it. Before the A00 discovery, estimas, tes for the Y-chromosomal atom, the name scientists give to the patrilineal most recent common ancestor of all living men, typically ranged between 140,000 and 200,000 years ago. The extreme genetic divergence of haplogroup A00 forced a radical recalculation of that timeline. The initial 2013 analysis, incorporating A00 at the base of the tree, suggested an age of approximately 338,000 years ago. It is worth being clear about what Y-chromosomal atom is and is not. He was not the first man, and he doubled as not the only man alive at his time. He is simply the individual whose paternal line survived all the way to the present day, W without dying out. Every other male lineage from his era went extinct along the way. His was the one that kept producing sons, generation after generation, across hundreds of thousands of years. The A00 discovery meant that even that anchoring date was dear wrong, and wrong by more than 100,000 years. The scientific debate that followed was sharp and unresolved. A sub-6 UN analysis published in the European Journal of Human Genetics argued that the original team had made methodological errors that inflated the age estimate, and that a corrected calculation placed the A00 divergence at approximately 208,000 years ago, rather than 338,000. The original team pushed back, defending their methodology. The argument has not been fully settled, but H-error is what is not in dispute. Regardless of which dating method is accepted, haplogroup A00 is definitively the most ancient inch of the entire human male family tree ever documented. Whether it diverged 200,000 years ago or 338,000 years ago, it is older than any other lineage ever found in a living human being, by a margin that is not close. Subsequent research confirmed that this ancient lineage was not unique to one family in South Carolina. Scientists traced it to a specific region in western Cameroon, finding it concentrated among men from the Yemabio and Bangwa ethnic groups. That connection told a story of its own. Albert Perry's ancestors had almost certainly been brought from West Central Africa to America during the transatlantic slave trade. The lineage that ended up in the plantation records of South Carolina was the same lineage that had survived in a small isolated population in Cameroon for what may be the longest stretch of any known paternal line in human history. The implications of this reach beyond genealogy. The existence of the A00 lineage provides evidence that modern humans likely interbred with archaic hominin populations in Africa, preserving ancient genetic sequences that scientists had assumed were long extinct. The data suggests that modern humans emerged from a process far more complex than a clean single-origin story. A University of Cambridge study drawing on the 1000 Genomes Project went further. Researchers found evidence that modern humans are the result of a genetic mixing event between two ancient populations that diverged around 1.5 million years ago. About 300,000 years ago, these groups came back together, with one contributing roughly 80% of the genetic makeup of modern humans, and the other contributing 20%. The A00 lineage may be a survivor from the edges of that mixing event, a thread from one of those older populations that wound its way forward through time and landed, improbably, in the hands of a genealogy company in the 21st century. But the picture had one more dimension that no one had anticipated before the genetic data started arriving. It was not simply that certain populations were old. It was that some populations had remained so isolated for so long that they had effectively become living archives, preserving biological and genetic information that the rest of humanity had long since mixed away. And nowhere was that archival quality more striking than in an island archipelago sitting in the Bay of Bengal, where a group of people had been living in what researchers described as complete genetic separation since the earliest days of the out-of-Africa migration itself. Research published in the Journal of Human Genetics concluded that the mitochondrial lineages of the Andaman Islanders, the indigenous peoples of the Andaman archipelago, had survived in complete genetic isolation from all other South and Southeast Asian populations since the initial settlement of the region during the out-of-Africa migration. These are not simply old populations in the way that long-established civilizations are old. These are populations whose genetic signatures have been sealed, almost untouched, since the first great movement of modern humans out of the African continent. Genetic analysis confirmed they are the descendants of Paleolithic peoples who were once likely dispersed widely across ancient Asia, but whose lineages elsewhere were assimilated or replaced, leaving the Andaman Islands as the only place those original signatures survived. That pattern of ancient lineages, surviving not because they were dominant, but because they were unreachable, would turn out to be one of the most important recurring themes in the entire science of genetic age. There is a pattern running through everything the research has revealed, and once you see it, it changes how you think about the entire question. The populations that rank oldest in their DNA are almost never the ones that built the monuments. They are almost never the ones whose names fill the history books or whose empires are taught in schools. The populations sitting at the deepest roots of the human family tree are, with remarkable consistency, the ones that the expanding world could not easily reach. Isolation, it turns out, is one of the most powerful preservers of genetic antiquity, and the story of what happened to those populations when that isolation finally ended is a lesson that genetics alone cannot fully contain. Think about what unites the groups that emerged from this research. The Koisan of southern Africa, whose lineage diverged from all other modern humans as early as 90,000 years ago, survived for most of their history in the dry, inhospitable expanses of the Kalahari. Terrain that larger, better-armed populations had little incentive to contest until relatively recently. A 2024 study in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, reported 9,000 years of genetic continuity in southernmost Africa, a region whose long and unusually deep population history is now one of the most documented in the world. That continuity was not accidental. It was the product of geography working as a shield. The Aboriginal Australians, whose ancestors crossed the ocean to reach Sahel 60,000 years ago and then became genetically isolated for all but the final fraction of that span, were separated from the rest of humanity by water. The Andaman Islanders maintained their ancient lineages in an archipelago that other populations had no pressing reason to invade, until colonial powers arrived, at which point the population collapsed catastrophically within decades. The lesson encoded in that pattern is uncomfortable, and the science does not flinch from it. The deepest roots of the human family did not survive because the populations that carried them were protected or celebrated. They survived in spite of the world that surrounded them. And in several documented cases, the arrival of the modern world brought those lineages to the edge of extinction. The Andamanese, once numbering in the thousands, were reduced to a few hundred within living memory of contact. The Koisan, who may once have comprised the majority of living humans on Earth for much of the past 150,000 years, now number approximately 100,000 individuals. The people who sat at the beginning of the human story became, in historical time, among its most marginalized. What is striking about the genetic picture as a whole is how thoroughly it dismantles the assumption that age and influence travel together. For most of recorded history, the civilizations that dominated the telling of human origins were those that had produced writing, cities, and armies. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Chinese, the Mesopotamians. Ancient genomic evidence now shows that the deepest population split in all of modern human history, the one between Koisan and all other humans, may have begun as early as 260,000 to 350,000 years ago. The agricultural empires whose histories are written in stone are, by comparison, recent arrivals. Every dynasty, every written language, every walled city, all of it sits in the final thin layer of a timeline whose deeper chapters were written in the bodies of people who left no monuments at all. That understanding has also forced a rethinking of what the science is actually measuring when it ranks populations by DNA age. What it is not measuring as superiority or advancement or any quality that translates into a hierarchy of human worth. What it is measuring is something far more specific and far more interesting: the age of the last significant mixing event. A population with very old DNA is not a population that never changed. It is a population that was sufficiently isolated from large-scale gene flow for long enough that its ancestral signatures remained readable. Research from the University of Cambridge found that modern humans are themselves the product of a genetic mixing event between two ancient populations that diverged around 1.5 million years ago, meaning that even the baseline of the human genome is a record of encounter, absorption, and merger, rather than a single unbroken line. There is no population on Earth whose DNA is purely itself. Every genome is a palimpsest, a surface written over and written over again with older text still faintly visible beneath. Branch of the human Y-chromosome tree found in Africa, with living relatives among the Embo people of Cameroon. A lineage that may have been preserved in an isolated community in West Central Africa for hundreds of thousands of years crossed the Atlantic involuntarily, survived generations of erasure, and then announced itself through a consumer genealogy kit. The science did not go looking for it. It came forward on its own. The largest genomic study ever conducted among Ko and San groups revealed that these southern African populations are the descendants of the earliest diversification event in the history of all humans, some 100,000 years ago, well before the out-of-Africa migration that populated the rest of the world. That single finding reframes the entire map of human prehistory. The journey outward, the colonization of Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas, was not the beginning of the human story. It was a departure from something far older. The populations that stayed or that reached geographic dead ends and remained there carry the evidence of that older story in every cell of their bodies. What DNA has ultimately revealed is not a ranking in the way a competition produces a ranking. It is something more like a geological map, showing which layers of human history are closest to the surface and which have been buried deepest by the sediment of time and movement. The oldest lineages are not the most powerful or the most numerous. They are the most undisturbed. And the fact that they have survived at all, through ice ages, through colonial violence, through the relentless pressure of expanding populations, is a form of tenacity that no trophy or title could adequately describe. The science is still moving. Ancient DNA extraction techniques improve every year, and each new genome sequenced from a previously unstudied population carries the possibility of pushing these timelines further back, or of revealing connections that no one has yet imagined. Top discoveries in ancient DNA research continue to surface previously unknown lineages at both ends of the great human dispersal from Africa, and new ways of reading genomic data keep illuminating questions that earlier methods could not even properly formulate. The map is not finished, it may never be finished, but the results already in hand are enough to make one thing clear. The oldest human on Earth is not a fossil, not a skeleton, not a skull behind museum glass. The oldest human lineages are living. They are speaking languages that have existed longer than agriculture. They are standing on land their ancestors walked before any other people arrived. And if you want to understand where the human story truly begins, you do not look to the first cities. You look to the people who were already there, long before the idea of a city existed at all.